The goal here is not that Canada is the largest market for AI in the world, right? It's never going to be that. But if we make it the most willing to try new solutions or to work with startups, that's where we might have an opportunity.
Okay, we have been talking a lot about AI on the BetaKit podcast lately, and for good reason. It's very compelling, very exciting, very scary. It has the potential to impact every industry, much like mobile and the cloud did in years past. So, how are Canadian businesses addressing that? What's our capacity in Canada for adoption? What does that look like? Well, it turns out we happen to have a global innovation cluster working on that, Scale AI. They used to be a supercluster, RIP, but they are still regularly committing millions of dollars to fund AI initiatives across Canada. And they also just released a research report that they say is a Canadian AI portrait, pointing to our country's strengths and weaknesses when it comes to AI, and maybe a bit of a reality check on what can and cannot be achieved. The frankness of this assessment matches the tone Clément Bourgogne, Scale AI's chief operating officer, provides on this podcast talking to me and Rob. Now, this episode runs longer than most, but it comes with a few surprises. And it's worth digging into how Canada is actually commercializing AI amongst the hype and understanding why Scale AI's focus is on supply chains and not that scary, exciting, compelling generative AI. So, how can Canada build an AI-powered economy? Let's dig in. All right, Clément, I think the best place to start here to set it up for people who don't know is for have you to explain exactly what Scale AI is, the mission, and I guess the role it's trying to play in the Canadian ecosystem.
So Scale AI is an investment fund that is focused on AI that's applied to supply chains. Our mission is to try to transfer the great knowledge that we've acquired in our academic centers in Canada to the real economy. I mean, it's important to understand the genesis of Scale AI, and it was created by members of the AI ecosystem and members of the supply chain ecosystem in Canada. And so why did these two ecosystems come together? Well, it was sparked by the Supercluster initiative that was launched in 2017, but it was a long time coming. It wasn't just a response to that. And so what we do is we use public funds in order to accelerate the deployment of AI technologies into supply chains. Now, I'm just going to take 1 second to explain why it makes so much sense to use supply chains to deploy applied AI solutions. And I'm assuming people know about AI in different ways, but AI is two things, right? It's
the thing that's going to control us in 3 days.
Right. It's the machine that's going to take over your jobs and your children and your personal life. So it's machine learning, but machine learning is a fancy way of saying it's algorithmic, it's math, it's equations. It's just statistical models to make a prediction. So what is the outcome, the prediction that a certain event will happen? We have had these techniques forever, right? It's just, we used to make predictions based on very few data sets. So machine learning is about making predictions. And then AI is another body of technologies, which is operational research, which is broadly speaking about optimizing things. So AI is a combination of two things: making predictions and optimizing stuff. So when you think about where can you apply this, obviously there's a lot of really famous and well-known areas of applications, whether it's autonomous vehicles or generative AI that we have now, but this was not the most obvious one at first. But I mean, AI is really well suited to supply chains. And supply chains, this is 2017. No one cared about supply chains. Like, no one even knew what a supply chain was, right? Today, everyone is an expert in supply chains. But back in 2017, like, this was...
I literally just got a book delivered that I pre-ordered in 2017 that has been waiting for a couple of years to make it to me because of...
That's right.
the great logistical cluster cost that's been ongoing for the past several years due to COVID and just I guess a variety of boats that have gotten stuck in canals causing havoc around the world.
A few events like that,
a
right?
couple of
And
events.
So no one cared about supply chains before, and no one thought about them. But it turns out supply chains are about two things, right? It's about predictions and optimization. It's about, what type of predictions? Well, how much stuff am I going to sell? How much inventory should I carry? Where should I put this inventory? And then the optimizing thing is, what's my best path to deliver, or how do I optimize the resources I have to maximize profit? So it turns out supply chains are extremely well suited to the application of AI. And as we noticed over the last 2 years, supply chains are core to our economy, right? Like in Canada alone, back in 2017, this was 10% of the GDP that relied on this, and over 1 million jobs, right? So it made a lot of sense for these two ecosystems to come together and say, hey, look, our purpose, our mission at Scale AI is to try to create an AI ecosystem, an AI industry that's going to be self-sustained. There's a lot of industries where you can try that. Supply chains made so much sense to it. At the same time, be an engine for economic development, because the genesis of the supercluster program was to try to bridge the productivity gap that Canada has with other countries, with peer nations. So Scale AI, to go back to your initial question, we're this investment fund and we use public money, but we're not a government organization where everyone on my team comes from the business world. No one is from the government. We think like an investment fund, except our returns aren't, dollars that we get back that we reinvest or that we give to shareholders. Our returns are we creating a self-sustaining ecosystem industry, and are we creating, value for this country, whether it's for the companies that are using AI or the jobs that they're created. So that's what Scale AI is in our mission. And so our mission is to make supply chains in Canada the best they can be, using the incredible knowledge and expertise we have in our academic centers. Turns out this is an incredibly difficult task that we embarked on 4 years ago.
Difficult in what way? And because, obviously with the supply chain stuff we're talking about, in terms of managing that or optimizing it, obviously very complex systems, large data sets, which would lend itself to machine learning or these sorts of innovations. Is the complexity in developing, because I think one of the components here of the supply chain is truly applied AI. We're not talking R&D here. We're talking about commercialized applications, essentially. Where is the difficulty point in that? We might be leading ourselves to the report that you recently released through Scale AI here, but are you talking about traditional difficulties that any kind of an investor would have? Or is it something to do with the sector? I'd love to dig into that more.
Sure. And it's definitely going to bring us to that report, but it's not a technology or technical difficulty. It's difficult because it is cutting edge by nature. These are really advanced techniques, but they're mastered, right? We have people in our universities and in a growing number of our businesses that understand this tech, that know how to leverage it. So the technology aspect is not the challenge. The challenge is going back to that original mission of how do we create an economy based on this? Well, we have had some public money, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. And so the way we are positioned, it's very different from a lot of other government programs and funding agencies, because our entire purpose and our vision is to fundamentally de-risk private investments, to stimulate private investments, not to replace them. So everything that we've done up to today is just to identify how do we bring down the financial risk sufficiently so that businesses in Canada invest in this highly innovative and highly risky technology. So that's why it's challenging, because there's a cultural difficulty with dealing with innovation in our businesses in Canada. And so because applied AI is so cutting edge, is so far advanced, this is usually the last thing that companies want to invest in. And so we come in, and part of our role is to bring down the financial risk, but part of our role is also to act as a Sherpa, as a guide, as an advisor to help companies understand, why do I start? This is what's so difficult for this thing to take off. Companies are bombarded by messages saying, you need to do AI. If you're not doing AI, you're going to die because someone else is going to use AI and going to steal all your customers. And so large businesses, they have fancy advisors, and I'm a recovering consultant. So they have companies that are extremely well equipped to help them deal with this. But think about the SME, and you're not talking necessarily just about the 50-person SME in the middle of nowhere. You have SMEs that are several hundred employees. The CEO is focused on keeping the lights on making payroll, on delivering to his clients, on finding people. And at the same time, they're told, if you don't invest in this tech, you're dead. This is a petrifying message, right? If you don't understand the tech, if you don't know where to start, it's not a productive way of engaging and encouraging companies.
Yeah, you don't want a fear-based innovation model here.
Right. Our role is to help these companies, to help them identify, what can AI do for your business and how can this be linked to your business strategy? And then where do you start and who do you do it with?
Okay, so there is a bit of maybe matchmaking there in terms of prospective partners. I know we covered just before the end of the year a bunch of Scale AI investments in FreshBooks. I actually don't know how to pronounce the name, if it's Plusgrade or Plugrad.
Yeah.
Plusgrade, okay. And a couple other companies receiving, as you're saying, relatively small investments. Like FreshBooks getting $2.8 million as a small investment, but specifically to develop proprietary health score models to model financial metrics for small to medium-sized businesses. Plusgrade's working with Air Canada, hopefully helping Air Canada with a variety of potential solutions related to logistical concerns they have there. So are you there facilitating with them and scoping the potential work here? Do you have these candidate companies coming to you and saying, hey, we think there's an opportunity, help us find a customer for this? Do you have Air Canada's coming to you saying, help us find a developer for the solutions that we need? Is it a combination? I'm understanding that you don't play the same role as a traditional investor. Interested in the dynamics of this, because as we might get to, the mandate laid out for the superclusters was very broad, and the efficacy of this has been kind of limited by each individual cluster's capacity to move the needle. So I'd be very much interested in how Scale AI approaches that intersection.
Totally. And so just for context, Scale AI was officially launched in spring of 2019. That's when I joined, and essentially that's when we had the legal right to start doing stuff. This is when our mandate was signed. So it's essentially 4 years. 2 of those years were during full pandemic. So it hasn't been that long. What we've done in that time is we've generated $500 million of investments. That includes private and Scale AI funding through a little over 100 projects. These involve, if I recall, 520 partners. So collaboration is core to whatever we do. So that's the context, right? The key here is these investments are going to generate $5 billion of value. And it's important here to clarify that this is an economic impact, with, the indirect jobs. And no, this is when you sum up what the projects are going to either create in additional revenues or in costs saved, it's going to generate $5 billion, 10x return. And this is very much on track for going there. So why am I saying this? Because in this portfolio of 100 projects, there's a very large range of projects, both in terms of magnitude and in terms of partnerships. And they've evolved a little bit over time. But as I mentioned earlier, very large organizations typically come to Scale AI because they have teams of people who are looking for free public money. Right, so they come in and they've heard about this. Either we have ongoing relationships and they want to get additional support for their initiatives, and they come in. It's part of the business model that there's nothing wrong with this. It's going to help them do more than they currently do, and that's important for us. And usually they come in with an existing partner that they have, a service provider who's going to take care of the tech. The role that we play in this instance is to increase the collaborative nature of the project. What does this mean? It can mean either there's more than one service provider that's involved. And we've done this, for example, on very large projects with Pratt & Whitney, with Kruger. They came in with big consulting firms. We said, well, that's great, but we would like to see some smaller players having a meaningful role in those projects. And you have companies like Vuban or MoveAI who were involved in the project as a result of us going to these companies saying, look, you need to create value for this ecosystem. So it could be, on the service provider side. It could also be on the supply chain side of things. Think about, the suppliers or the clients of this very large organization. We've pushed a lot of companies to say, well, look, you're developing this tool that's supposed to optimize the inventory of your spare parts for your network. But why don't you work with your suppliers of those spare parts so they gain visibility and they can feed you some data and create more value for it? So that's something that we always encourage, and we actually don't approve projects if there's not elements of collaboration on these two sides. For SMEs though, and I use SMEs in a very broad sense of the term. There could be medium-sized businesses that are above 500 FTEs, but for these companies, this is where our role is a lot broader. There's a lot of companies that come to us because they know they want to do AI. Maybe they have an understanding of what AI can do for them, but they don't know who to do it with. They don't know where to start, and it's very, very frequent that companies come in and they have 12 use cases. They want to solve all of these problems at once. They come in and the service provider has told them it's possible and it's going to be done in 18 months. So a big part of our role at the beginning is just to say, walk before you run. Pick whatever is going to drive the most value for your business. We just launched a call for projects for hospitals. So we have a specific amount of money that we're going to dedicate to fund projects that deploy AI to solve logistics issues within hospitals, not diagnostic, just the intra-hospital logistics. During this launch, we reached out to most hospitals across Canada to warn them that this was coming. And we said, if you are looking for partners, tell us first, what problems are you hoping to solve? We got about 15 of them that showed up to the event last week. And then on the backside, we had service providers and we understood their capabilities, their expertise, and what they actually could do. And each hospital met 3 service providers that were exactly a good match to their issues, right? The thinking and the matchmaking, this is what our teams do on a daily basis. We've done it in this call for projects, but we do it on a weekly basis with companies that come to us, right? And so that's a huge part of the value that we create. And it's a huge role. No one else is playing this role. But if you don't have that, you can't run an AI project.
Okay. It's interesting. We're talking about this de-risking on a lot of different lenses. Like, obviously, I completely understand hey, let's provide some financial incentives here to make it easy for experimentation and onboarding companies into this new reality, either on the development or the customer side. It's interesting that there seems to be a de-risking that Scale AI is performing in terms of like preventing scope creep from happening related to the focus of this, and almost based upon the historicals of capital you deployed and the amount of projects you've done, some best practice guidelines so that people aren't spinning their wheels. I'm wondering if you could help us reconcile that with how the common understanding of Canada is from an AI perspective. Joshua Bengio, Jeffrey Hinton, U of T, Mila. We've got AI coming out of our ears, all the smartest people. Everyone wants our talent. And it seems like you're like, well, actually, there needs to be a lot of hand-holding and crawl, walk, run development here in Canada. I don't know if that gets us to the Canadian AI portrait that Scale AI put out, but I just wanted to maybe pause there because we don't often hear, well, maybe we do. We do hear a lot about Canadian businesses and Canadian industry that are risk adverse, maybe slow to develop and adopt technologies. You don't usually hear that from the AI lens, given the AI narrative that our audience is used to. Can you explain the tension there?
Absolutely. So when we produced the AI at Scale report, our intention was to assess where Canada was in its development of an AI-powered economy, from an honest and actually comprehensive perspective. So this is secondhand research. This is not our data. This is a review of, I think, 40 plus different sources to try to make sense of it, right? Because what we hear in the news is Canada's so great. Canada has an edge in AI. We're global leaders. And so what we try to do is to provide an honest portrait of where do we really stand. And in order to do that, we used a fairly standard framework that's been around for quite a while. That's called the innovation value chain. It was well described by the Harvard Business Review and some smart people there, but we adapted this very slightly to AI to make sense of it. So what this framework does is it breaks down in the innovation value chain in 3 segments. The first one is R&D, so idea generation, where ideas are born and created. The second one is what we called early adoption in the context of AI. So who are the first companies using it? And the last one is diffusion. So when AI is being used at scale. So we use this approach to try to segment the analysis. And what the report comes up with as a conclusion is Canada is doing really, really well and punching above its weight in the R&D sector. We generate ideas really well because of the incredible experts and so many more that are in our academic centers. On the early adoption, there are some very encouraging factors and some strength, but there are also some pretty strong obstacles to overcome. And in diffusion, this is our Achilles heel. This is where we're really trailing behind. So this is the assessment. What we tried to do then is to say, well, what does this mean for Canada? And so what we then did is we summarized this. I'm an ex-consultant, so 2x2 matrices are still resonating in my ears. But we tried to put this, try to assess a country's relationship to AI on a vertical axis with the supply side. So how much talent is there? How many researchers, how many startups are supplied to the ecosystem? And on the horizontal side, what is the demand? How much demand is there from businesses trying to adopt AI? This is, again, in the context of Scale AI's mission. So applied AI, not just in supply chains, but in this applied AI, not necessarily R&D. What we came up with as an assessment is Canada is a little bit at a crossroads. We have the opportunity. So we are very strong in terms of supply. We have great talent. We have lots of students that come to study here, but we're very low on the demand side.
In gross or like per capita?
Per capita, we are punching way above our weight in terms of supply side. So when you break down the supply, you look at the number of researchers, the quality of those researchers, the birth of startups. All of these indicators are actually quite good, even in gross. But per capita, we're really punching way above our weight.
On the demand side, though?
No, that was on the supply side. On the demand side, this is where we're trailing massively behind.
Also, as an ex and maybe current consultant, isn't this the same problem as the other sectors that we've had in the past? In Canada, we have a lot of research, but very little appetite to take risks as buyers and so on.
It's not. Fundamentally, it's not. And I'm not an expert in other topics, but I think the conclusion is the same, right? Like right now, the story is repeating itself in that we have great researchers. They're producing outstanding research. The problem is it's benefiting a lot foreign companies. And they're like, these companies came here, right? They opened AI labs. They all set up shops.
Well, they announced them. Some of them opened. There was a lot of announcements.
Yeah.
Well, like other countries, we've staked a claim on AI years ago, and we've had some successes over the last number of years, but it seems like the traction is elsewhere. Are we even competing?
No, this is the core of what we try to do. And the reality is Canada will never be number one in applied AI. It's not going to happen, right? You look at the numbers and versus the US and China, the number of researchers, like the numbers are just staggering. But I don't think it's fair to expect Canada to be number one, right? The reason I quit consulting to go to Scale AI was because I thought there was something to do here. I think we just need to be realistic about what we can do because AI is so many things. And what we can do is build a really, really strong and unique niche that's going to help us build an economic sector that's going to be self-sustained. But we're never going to dominate all of AI, right? Applications of AI go into autonomous vehicle. Hey, we lost this, right? Like it's already done. Like there's already leaders. Fintech, we don't have the investment capacities in those to compete on a global basis, right? So we have to find this niche. it turns out we believe that supply chain is one that's still up for grabs. That could really be a good stronghold for Canadian AI, but we're never going to dominate AI like across the spectrum.
Isn't part of the problem that we don't have the data? I'm thinking back to lots of the companies that are AI companies in Canada, but they're reliant on others' data, often US-based companies, to even succeed. I'm thinking like in verticals like retail, RubiCloud, or fintech, FreshBooks, and other verticals like healthcare and so on.
Well, the FreshBooks example is a good one because I don't see that doesn't directly relate to supply chains there. It's quasi-fintech.
I believe that this is a sector where we can, as a sector, take a leadership. That doesn't mean they won't be great companies that are built in Canada that will have, some leadership position, right? There are some of the ones you mentioned. There are some really cool companies that came out of the Montreal or Toronto ecosystems that are global leaders in their sphere. That's not supply chain. As a sector, though, I don't see healthcare as a viable way to construct it because there's no market for it, right? Like we have to, I mentioned the call for projects we're doing for hospitals. We're footing 100% of the bill here, right? There is absolutely no investment capacity in our healthcare system to try to nurture this. And it's important. And that's also one of the aspects of the report. And it's important because entrepreneurs set up their base where their clients are, right? Yes, if they come out of university, maybe they live there, their family lives here. But like if 80% or 90% of their customers are in the US, well, they're going to move there. They're going to be closer there, So that's why it's important to create this market, this demand for this niche of supply chain tech, because not only are we going to be able to keep the best entrepreneurs that are born here, or that are not in a literal sense, but those that come out of universities and start their businesses, we're also, if we become such an attractive market, we're also going to attract the best entrepreneurs from abroad who are going to set up here because their first clients will be Canada, right? So that's why increasing demand is so important. And I don't think the battle is lost on this. I think there are some very positive signs of companies that are investing in it, but it's just we need to be focused on where we put our money and where we invest and where we support our entrepreneurs. There's so many shiny objects in AI. We can sprinkle a little bit of money everywhere. I don't think that's going to help us get like a very strong foothold in one sector. I think supply chains is definitely the one to focus on. I'm not sure about the others.
The BetaKit podcast is sponsored by Osler, Hoskin & Harcourt, LLP. Osler is the leading business law firm for startups, high-growth companies, and investors in Canada, and for the second year, the firm has released the Deal Points Report, Venture Capital Financings, a study of 353 anonymized Canadian venture capital and growth equity financings. This report looks at deals from 2020 to 2022, valued at more than $6 billion USD, and provides data and insights for founders, entrepreneurs, investors, and advisors contemplating transactions. The report draws on publicly available data on venture capital and growth equity financings, as well as Osler's confidential, anonymized data sources. You can read the Deal Points Report, Venture Capital Financings at osler.com and let them know that BetaKit sent you. I don't fully understand why Canada specifically has an opportunity to be this leader in supply chains. Is it because there is no clear leader yet? Does it have to do with our other sectors when it comes to extractive natural resources, some of our auto manufacturing, other considerations related to Canada that makes this an opportunity for us? We talked about supply chain being amenable to AI. What was it that made Scale AI choose this because Canada had a chance in it?
There's two reasons for this, right? It's important to leverage AI in service of the rest of our economy, right? I think we need to also understand that having a strong AI economic sector is not in itself the end goal. It's to have a really strong body of companies that will develop tech that will make the other companies better and more productive and more competitive against our peers. So it's building a sector that's going to be at the service of the rest of the economy, not just a new sector on its own, which it would become as well, but it's important to have that in mind. Why are supply chains an opportunity to do that? Canada is actually a very strong hub for trade, right? A lot of stuff goes through Canada because we have a very good commercial relationship with the US, and that's attracting a lot of goods, services through Canada. So that's why supply chains are a little bit unique for Canada. Not that, they have the best supply chains versus the world, but there is an opportunity to drive economic activity, and there is this global position that Canada holds that gives it a potential edge.
We pretend to be AI enthusiasts, or at least people openly tracking it, but our supply chain knowledge is very limited. This is not a supply chain podcast. So that was the connective tissue that I was looking for in terms of how it connects more broadly to the Canadian economy. And I think it's a point well taken that there isn't going to be, like Louis Têtu, every time I talk to him, is like, AI isn't going to be a sector. It is going to be a thing that changes all sectors in the way that mobile and cloud and other tech generations did the exact same thing across economies around the world. And I think recording a podcast with someone based in Montreal. It's a point and a port well taken. So then let's get back to maybe some of the insights. Like, we've talked a lot about the problems here. Can we shift a little bit to the problemtunity of how we take some of the positives that we hear, how we're punching above the weight, and the matching, like talking about how you're lowering some of the risk, you're playing matchmaker, you're making investments. I would think probably doing some best practice training here. What are some of the other components that are needed to kind of complete this loop?
Once we finished the report and we said, well, Canada has two ways it can go. Either it increases the demand and therefore it finds opportunities for this great supply to stay here, to develop, to grow, and then we become essentially an AI-powered economy. And it's an illustration, but that's one path, the one we want to be on. Or, we don't manage to grow demand, and therefore we kind of remain this backstore R&D shop for other people, and eventually we will lose this edge because our researchers will be attracted somewhere else, and we will eventually lose some of the great talent. So we think that this path here, we wouldn't necessarily be able to keep a significant leadership position in R&D on the long term. Medium term, there's no risk. So how do we make sure that we become an AI-powered economy? The role, at least, that Scale AI is going to play, right? There's a lot of people that need to do things, and we are Scale AI. We're not going to save the world. Look, we were renewed last month or earlier this year for another 5 years. We got a $125 million. That's a lot of money, but compared to the AI investments being announced elsewhere, it's not that much either, right? So we need a lot of players to come together and to do things. How is Scale AI going to try to accelerate this, and what is our strategy going forward? It's anchored around 3 axes. The first one is massively attract more investors, attract more private investment into this sector in Canada. Secondly, in order to attract these investors, you need to better understand the risk. It doesn't mean lowering the risk. Better understanding and identifying the risk inherent to an AI project and mastering it is not the same as saying there's no risk, right? And the third one is help these investors and companies understand what value they can derive from AI. Because right now, most companies are they've been told by consultants or by the press or by their neighbors that they have to do AI, but they don't necessarily know, if I invest $1 million in this, I'm going to get 3 million cost savings or additional revenues. So
you might have a viral tweet, at least.
Yeah, exactly. It's normal because it's still new, and it's not like there are all these benchmarks that people can draw from. And when they go to industry events, it's not like all their peers have done it and they're able to compare, right? So these 3 axes, they work hand in hand. More investors means more private companies, the big corporations, all of these companies that are adopting it, they need to inject some money. But that's not all, right? There are angel investors, there's VCs, you guys talk about that all the time, right? There's private equity firms, there's institutional. How can we leverage each of these investors in different ways in order to inject capital? There's different strata depending on the different types of investors. But all of them will want a certain reassurance about what's my risk and what's my potential reward. And that's why the work that we do is not trivial. Doesn't mean all of our investments work out, because by definition, it's innovation. There will be failures, and that's okay. But we've at least done the work to make sure that everything that could be prevented before was looked at.
I don't think the expectation here is that Scale AI is the sole solution to these. As Rob said, I was confused. I'm like, I don't understand this weird tension between what we're told about AI and some of the problems you're noting. And it's like, oh no, it's the exact same problems we have in other industries. And then it clicked for me. So presenting the Scale AI program with your mandate and your budget size as the full requirement or capacity to deliver on this, I think is really useful to explicitly note is not the case. But you've been touching on a couple of other things here that could be useful or that in the report, are lacking. I just want to note from the investment side we were talking about here, really seems like some of our strategic innovation fund budget or our VCCI budget in service of fund of funds and generating more net investments could be driven towards this sector. I'll just note that here. I'm not sure that that's something that we would fairly ask you to comment on, but something I do want to get you to comment on is the IP stuff, because you had mentioned this before. You had described a scenario, this almost a new branch plant economy model where we are kind of the outsourced R&D plant here. And I know the report specifically was noting foreign companies still hold a significant share of AI-related intellectual property generated in Canada. We just had Budget 2023 drop, and I know one of the concerns and criticisms there was for all the commitments to clean tech and additional innovation funding in very, I think, specialized sectors outside of this, there's still no overall strategy for intellectual property. And that's been an ask for a couple of years now. Just to quote for our listeners who didn't read our amazing budget rundown, we had Adam Kingsley of the Intellectual Property Institute of Canada saying, so once again, big spending on R&D, yet no mention of earmarking any of the funds for protecting the resulting intellectual property. More broadly, no real mention of IP in a budget said to try and grow our economy. And then Ben Bergen, who runs the Council of Canadian Innovators, CCI, we've had on the podcast previously. You might have heard us referencing him in our John Ruffalo podcast a couple episodes back, noted that the commitment from the government on the clean tech strategy is missing the other half, which is an IP focus. And he said a clean tech strategy without a real plan in place to protect these assets will just keep subsidizing other countries' success. You had touched upon the IP stuff here, and how we're punching above our weight from R&D, but how all these foreign companies launched AI R&D hubs across Canada, Toronto, Montreal, very specifically, also some stuff in Alberta. Do you feel like Scale AI could better service its mandate if some of these things that at a federal innovation policy level have been asked for years were higher on the priority list? In those higher things up the stack that you're pointing to after where Scale AI plays, do you see a potential for the investment and the value you're driving here to eventually just be captured by foreign national corporations because we don't have that IP protection? Is there anything that Scale AI plays with at that level that's aiding to that, or is this a big gap here that you're missing? I just love to have you dig in on the IP stuff because we get yelled at about it from all sides, and it seems to be, really at a point of inflection here for specifically with AI where Scale AI is playing.
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying I'm not an IP expert. We have one at Scale AI who is probably one of the best versed expert on IP for AI, right? There's a couple things here to unpack. First, just very briefly, I know you mentioned it in passing, but yeah, there could be synergies or collaboration opportunities to leverage other funding vehicles for government money. To be honest, that's kind of against our DNA, because fundamentally what Scale AI is trying to do is not to replace or substitute private funding, right? We're trying to stimulate it. And so if you bring in other agencies that bring in more dollars, and so eventually there's an 85% or 100% contribution from the government, that creates very little incentive for companies to make sure that their projects are successful. Our contribution rate for Scale AI has been between 30 and 35% effectively, right? Our nominal is 40 or 50%, depending on different things. But so our actual contribution to projects is 30 to 35%. We don't want to go above that because this is just the thresholds where companies are. It's linked to the question you have on IP, which is a very broad topic again. But one of the reasons why IP is being used to the benefit of foreign companies is because our Canadian companies are not investing. It's not because there is no regulation, or maybe that needs to be fixed, and maybe there are policies that need to be put in place. But fundamentally, the issue is our businesses are not setting up R&D labs and they're not collaborating with our researchers. They're not putting the dollars when other companies are seeing the value and they are doing so.
Is that a cultural thing, or is that because of some of the structural stuff? I'm just wondering, when you're speaking to some of the partner companies that you're working with or matching on either side, does IP even come up? Are they thinking of it at that level? Or is it an educational gap here in the companies that you're working with?
It definitely varies. The startups and the smaller or early traction companies tend to think of IP as an afterthought. It's not necessarily forefront to their thinking. That's actually something that my colleague works actively on. He meets with companies just to have a chat, not about the legal side of this, but the business aspect of IP. And this is where Scale AI's take on IP is core. Like generating IP so that it sits on shelves and those shelves are owned by a Canadian company makes no sense. Generating IP is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is for using IP, for this IP to create value. In AI, IP is not the same as in biotech or in others. So the discourse around IP for AI needs to be nuanced with the specificities of this. You have to think about IP in an AI project that Scale AI funds as like a tailor-made suit. The suit itself suits one person. If you try to wear it, well, the guy was too fat, it doesn't suit you, right? The real IP here is not the suit. It's not even the patron. It's the knowledge of how do you put the suit together. There are things in AI that can be patented, but IP in AI is not just about patents, right? So what we focus on in our projects is to make sure that the IP is used and creates value for the companies. What does this mean? Well, 2/3 of our projects actually have in the contract allowed the service provider, the companies developing the AI solution, to reuse the IP generated by the project in some capacity. And it's actually today it's 100%. We're just, we have some legacy projects that they weren't there yet. So what does this mean? It means that, the consulting firm of Vuban or Move AI, an Explore AI of this world, an Ivado Labs of this world, when they generate a custom solution, that custom solution can't be applied to another customer. However, the knowledge of how you come up with this custom solution, that sits with them, right? And they can go to another customer and earn their business there, right? So that is the key. That is our focus in our investments, is to make sure that the IP that's generated is usable by the people who can actually create value for it. So is it a cultural, is it, the report tries to identify some factors. I don't think we can answer it with data, but there is a very striking indicator in our report about industry concentration. It's essentially an index that assesses how concentrated are different sectors of our economy. And by concentrate means how much competition. The less competition, the more concentrated it is. And we compare the index for Canada to the US, to France, to Germany, to some of our well-known peers. It's not that there is a little bit more concentration here. It's that it's 5 times more concentrated than all of these countries, right? So the need to innovate for a business is not a primal one. It's not a survival one, right? From a business perspective. If you have the choice to invest your dollars in a fixed asset, it's not risky. You're not going to get slammed by management or by the executives for making a risky bet. Your company's survival doesn't rely on it. You're going to make that bet. You're not going to invest in software in high. So it's structural as much as it could be cultural, right? And it's important to note that there's no single factor that we can go there. But the important piece here is, how do we get out of that? Because that's what we want. Eventually, we want those companies to start investing. And the only way is to demonstrate value. And you don't need all companies to start doing AI in order to create this snowball effect, right? You need to convince a select few, because once they demonstrate the value, then everyone will follow suit. And then your providers have the IP and the knowledge in order to help those other companies do it. And in our context, the discussion around IP isn't about, are you generating patents that you own? Are you generating the IP that's going to help you win future business? And that's really core to all of our investments. It's part of it. As I mentioned earlier on, every project we invest in ends up with a solution that's deployed. Hence, someone is building that knowledge, that IP. I think that's where the discussion around IP in AI should be. I don't know about the other sectors, but to us, that's really the key.
you mentioned the three axes. The first two are well-established Canadian stories. The last one, I just want to make sure I'm clear on it. The fact that you work with those companies to actually materialize a thing is the demand gen piece that you said we're lacking as a country, is the demand. And your I think your point is not stupid, blind demand, but actually intellectually thought through demand. So you're actually building a thing that has value. Is that
sustainable
right?
demand?
So the weakness for Canada is diffusion, but you can't work on diffusion without working first on early adoption, because early adoption is a company starts their own project, right? So if you want to end up in diffusion, you need several things. You need those first projects, this first step, this first dive, but then you also need the structure to deploy AI at scale, right? In the report, we also highlight the chronic underinvestment that Canadian businesses have made into IT systems. Again, I work in my consulting life. You come in and you try to say, oh, well, IT can slash their cost, right? So IT is not necessarily seen as a value creative function, but for AI, it's the key enabling piece, right? Like, how is your data structured? Is it on like 10,000 employees' laptops and completely siloed and unaccessible, or is it well structured and accessible with like clear governance laws? Like, all of this underspend is making it much harder for companies, even those who start their first AI projects, to then diffuse it, because there are these systems that are not in place. So this infrastructure is there. There's also a lack of vision at the top of organizations, or at least sense of urgency in terms of deploying AI. There's a few data points that indicate that Canadian business leaders see AI as important for the future, but don't make it a priority or don't direct investments
Later
there.
important.
So, right, exactly. So eventually it'll be important, but for now I'm going to focus on building the next fixed assets, right?
So like if you could foment that sort of the sense of urgency in those businesses that have the data sets that actually could benefit from AI, do we have critical mass in Canada with the businesses that we do have to actually create the demand that will keep the businesses selling here? I can think of, the oligopolies, insurance companies, like you can probably count on both hands companies with enough data to actually run AI. Again, notwithstanding the relatively novel, small one-shot learning stuff that you're seeing, do we have that? If your dream came true and you actually could create that sense of demand, is there a market that will keep Canadians in Canada building for Canadian companies?
Yes, it will not be enough to sustain the growth of AI companies, forever, right? But the goal here is not that Canada is the largest market for AI in the world, right? It's never going to be that. But if we make it the most willing to try new solutions or to work with startups, that's where we might have an opportunity. And so very concretely, what does this mean? Because the early adoption relies on startups, right? Like a lot of the times it relies on startups. I didn't mention this earlier on, but Scale AI essentially has three different types of investment streams. The first one is the industry-led projects. So this is where we co-invest in industry-led. That's what I've been referring to this whole podcast. The other two are the streams that we put in place in order to support the growth of this ecosystem. One is about workforce development, and that means investing in training of the existing workforce, either for people to be better knowledgeable. Imagine your IT engineer, he needs to learn Python, right? Okay, so you upskill him. That's one way of thinking about it. But you also need your line manager to understand, what can AI do for my business? How do I identify an opportunity to solve a problem leveraging AI? How do I get better equipped in AI? I always make this parallel. AI is just another tool, right? So a tool, let's imagine Excel was just another tool. So you had to have people who coded Excel. Like you had programmers who came up with Excel. But these were not the people who created value within the businesses, right? It was all the financial planners, all the accountants. Like these are the people who needed to learn Excel, but from a different angle, from a different perspective. So you also need to invest in that workforce development. So that's why this was the second axis. And the third one is what we call the acceleration stream, which was aiming at ensuring that the startups that worked on stuff that Scale AI cared about got the support they needed from the ecosystem in Canada. Again, think about like 2017. You're an AI startup working on supply chain issues. not a single incubator would listen to you, right? So what we did is we skewed the market, and we have incredible relationships with Mars, with TMZ, with CDL, with like 30 partners across the country. Every province is represented. We even have some in the Yukon. Like all of our partners, we said, if you support startups that do AI for supply chains, we'll give you money. So we bias the market, and now it's more than 100 startups a year. So we're gonna reorient this to be more effective, because that bias is no longer needed. Yeah. Right. But that's what was needed to make sure that these companies got the support they needed and deserved.
One last question down this path. This is, I'm sure, an annoying one, but in pretty much every economy in the world, one of the biggest customers is the government.
Oh, shit. We're going to ask the procurement question.
And
Clément, I'm so sorry.
We're going to ask the procurement question. I'm
Listeners,
sorry, but
drink.
You're getting money from the government.
Podcast.
You're getting money from the government. Do you have to affect change, and can you affect change? I mean, that seems to be, they have shit tons of data. They could sure use some modernization.
I don't think the government's going anywhere.
Well, they have, and they're willing to spend. They have tons of cash. So, which they're proven they're willing to spend. Is that something that's in your mandate, in your purview? Can you do something? Will you do something? How do you look at that?
I'll give you a generic answer, and then I'll give you the real answer. So, yeah, it's going to be one of the levers to activate. But here's why I don't think it's one that we need to focus on right now. Doesn't mean we never focus on, but right now. AI solutions are still fundamentally developed by very small organizations. The government is absolutely not equipped at all to deal with these organizations, because obviously the government, and thankfully, has extremely high standards in terms of safety, security, standard levels of service. So the government is not necessarily the entity you want to take risk, right? Like, you don't want the CRA to try something new. You want them to use something established. So their sales cycles are crazy, right? For a startup, waiting 2.5 years just to get approval, and then another 2.5 years to get a plan to get deployed. That's not viable, right? So this is not the engine to start this cycle. Doesn't mean it can't be one to sustain it or to grow it later on. But I don't think procurement strategies plays a role in helping our startups grow. Eventually, totally, but right now, I don't think that's the mechanism. I want to pull on this thread, though, because startups, we haven't talked a lot about them, but they're really, really important, and they're part of the report, and they're really the asset that we have in Canada. Canada has a lot of startups that are born here, right? Like, a lot of startups are created in Canada, but our survival rate is not great. This is where Scale AI can really have, and we've done a little bit of this, but we're going to do a lot more leveraging these successes. Startups came to me during the first mandate of Scale AI almost on a weekly basis saying, can you help me find customers here? It's easier for me to sell to the US than it is to sell to Canada. I even had a startup saying the US subsidiary of the Canadian company has bought my product, but the Canadian one hasn't. So startups need access to the market, right? Like, grants for startups are great, but a contract is way better, right? So that's something that we've integrated into our mission and our projects. I've mentioned it in passing, but a lot of the work that we do is to help startups get their first clients, or to get their big client that's going to unlock the development of their product, right? So about half of our products are actually led by companies that are developing a new solution that they're going to commercialize to lots of companies, but they come to Scale AI with their first few clients. And what we say to the clients is, look, this is risky. We will cover a good chunk of the development cost. You don't have to do it, but you're the first adopters. The startup puts the rest of the money. And then that startup has a product they can sell to lots of people, right? And so sometimes, depending on the level of maturity of the startup, they come in, they don't even have their clients. And a big part of what we try to do, and I'm not saying we're great at it or we've cracked the code, this is something extremely difficult to do, but a big part of the mandate and what we try to do is to match these startups to potential clients. The beauty about Scale AI is, I've told you about this acceleration program just a minute ago. Well, what this gave us is 30 partners across the country that give us visibility into hundreds of startups in AI every year, right? So we have a catalog of AI. We know what they do because we might give them money to support these startups. So we have a good understanding what they do. On the flip side, we have a lot of companies that come to us that say, hey, I want to do AI. I don't know who to partner with. So a big part of the role that we play, and we've done it last week again, my team was setting up a meeting like this, is to put the startup in the same room as a company and say, hey, you want to build this new solution for your business objectives? This startup is the people you should do it with. And of course, this is a natural, there's still a lot of resistance because startups are risky. They don't have the track record. They don't have the resources. But at least
you can only play matchmaker so much. Someone's still got to swipe right at a certain point, right? Like gotta, yeah, okay.
Right. But the beauty is we can say, hey, look, it's going to cost you less, right?
Yes.
We can use this public money as this incentive, right? And that's
a free first date with as the matchmaker.
Exactly.
And the brand of Scale AI, who right?
Yeah. It's comped. Yeah. So I will say, what you're speaking to on the procurement side, and then also the easier to sell to the U.S. market consideration is not something that we're unfamiliar with across a variety of sectors, but I think it's important to note. Before we let you go, we got 2 more questions here about things
we were going to name the podcast that, just for the
record. Before we let you go, we have 2 more questions here that maybe we want to ask about impending developments that might be impacting the work that you're doing. I think the most obvious one is Bill C-27 and the ADA Act component of that. Just wondering what Scale AI's stance is on that. We've had multiple guests on in the past. We'll link to that in the show notes for our listeners, those episodes. There's been some criticisms of this bill being a little too general, a little too punitive, and then from some perspectives, because it's focused on the process component for some of these generative AI tools, like fundamentally conflicts with how the sausage is made, which is like you're not supposed to see how the sausage is made. You're just supposed to train sausage making. What is Scale AI paying attention to when it comes to ADA? Thoughts on it? Do you have like an official stance? This, it's been held up in Parliament a bit. Just what's the Scale AI take on that bill?
Right. So we don't have an official stance on it simply because there's nothing that's out or official, right? So
well, isn't that very convenient, sir?
Well, it is very convenient for me because I certainly don't want to overstep and talk about something I don't fully master. That doesn't mean that it's not important. That's not what I mean. But there are people at Scale AI who are experts at this and who do look at it very closely. My understanding of this bill is that a lot of it will rely on the regulations, which is not uncommon. And so what's currently being proposed is not necessarily going to have a material impact. What will have a material impact is the regulations. And we've always been active in trying to at least provide our perspective, which is a representation of the industry perspective. And so we will continue to do that as it goes forward to try to make regulations that make sense. I think right now the debate is crystallized around generative AI because of
all the tweets, because of all the viral tweets.
Yeah. And frankly, because of the high impact it can have on day-to-day life. What we focus on at Scale AI is productivity tools for businesses, right? So that doesn't mean there aren't ethical or security issues we need to look at, but it's much less impactful for society at large, right? We're just saying, how does a company help optimize its inventory, right? Do you really need regulation for this? There are things that need to be regulated, but by and large, productivity tools have been around for a while and they will continue to do so. So I think there are applications of AI that perhaps need a bit more attention than others. We're certainly going to play our role in the discussions around the applications that are relevant to what we do, and there are other people in the ecosystem that will talk about other applications.
Speaking of that, though, I find it interesting. Your CEO was one of the kind of AI leaders in the space that recently signed the open letter that got massive attention, calling for a 6-month pause on advanced AI developments to allow time for governments to set some regulatory guardrails. Chamath Palihapitiya has been very public recently about the need for us to having a similar thing to any of the regulators that we have for new medical products or things like that. If you're going to put something out, you have to be able to demonstrate the general health of the AI product you're releasing. Any comment there, or what would kind of lead your boss, I guess, to sign that, or the motivations behind that? Is it just to what you're speaking to? Like, there's got to be a regulatory component here, but these AI tools are moving relatively quickly. Like
the letter is actually pretty specific, right? It talks about investments and advances in AI in one application of AI, in generative AI, not all AI forever, right? Like that's not the letter. And so we're very close to other members of the ecosystem, and some very prominent ones have explained, I think
we mentioned Yoshua Bengio off the earlier, right? One of the signatories.
You mentioned him. But I mean, I think there are certainly some very good reasons to say certain applications of AI need to be careful about how fast we go. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that this applies to all AI, right? Should we slow down research in AI for medical purposes? Not sure, right? That doesn't mean there are no ethical considerations or bias. That needs to be looked at. But it's, again, very, very similar to the point I just made, right? The projects we invest in and advances in AI that are made in the sphere where we invest basically use proprietary data, right? Like it's the sales data or it's the internal data to a company. It's not at all the same issues that you are meddling with in generative AI and copyright issues and all of this stuff that's going to take quite a lot of effort to solve. So the applications of AI we do are much more contained and don't necessarily have these potential threats that generative AI.
It's not the really weird
poses.
Stuff.
Yeah, no, it isn't, because it's company data, right? Like it's not. It's certain, like let's leave it at the really weird stuff. I won't give examples because then you'll just click that.
No. It's hey. We've been exploring generative AI throughout this, but I think it's a point well taken. Similar to when you're talking about the supply chain stuff, the focus of this. I think you've provided a really helpful inroad for a lot of our listeners to understand, one, how this is being attacked, how it's being addressed, where the points of tension are, where support is needed, and the potential benefits. Because again, I kind of feel like there's a version of this podcast we could have recorded in 2004 about, okay, so you can get an email anywhere on this device you carry around called a smartphone. We still don't necessarily have the frameworks to understand the broad-reaching implications of this stuff. And I think you've done an excellent job of kind of partitioning out the components that Scale AI plays in, the opportunities it kind of has, and then the weird stuff. Clément, we just really appreciate you coming on the podcast with us.
Totally. And read the report, because it's pretty, but it's got some wacky statistics that are pretty.
You can tell our audience we're trying to sell them. Guys, if you look at the report, it'll be very pretty and it will provide you the insights.
It's nerdy and good.
And as a teaser, I can say this was what we used to develop our 5-year strategy, which will be released in the coming months. So
stay tuned for that. The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.